Now I want to introduce Chase Whiteside and Erick Stoll. They're students at Wright State University that traveled from Ohio to be with us today. And they're New Left Media, a production team that started in September 2009. So welcome, Chase and Erick.
So I'm going to have some notes with me because I'm not half as brilliant as Dan, and I don't want to have a Jan Brewer moment while I'm up here. So is my mic on and everything? Everyone can hear? We're concerned with the news. With so many things happening in the news right now, few of us have time to consider the nature of how the news is delivered to us, the new media technologies that bring us the news, and how they actually shape the content that they transport. In particular, we're concerned that newspapers, both as a medium and as a business model that worked for the past century, are dying, and that serious and substantial journalism is dying with them. It can't be overstated how vital newspapers have been to our democracy. When the framers of our Constitution mandated a freedom of the press and the First Amendment, it was newspapers they were referring to. And Thomas Jefferson perhaps best summed this up when he said, "Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter." Now, the demise of newspapers that we're seeing is technological in nature. For better or worse, the internet has revolutionized every old media industry, from magazines and book publishing to recorded music and radio, television and film. And when this is for media that's for entertainment purposes, most of these changes have been benign. They've been even bountiful. We can now have endless music libraries that are easily cataloged and accessed. You can find new music straight from your bedroom, for instance. But with media that's not necessarily meant for entertainment, like the news, there's some concerns. So how our habits have changed in regards to how we read the news seem harmless enough. We used to read the news in print, and today we're reading the news on the screen. But what is harder to get at is what that evolution of mediums has done to the news itself. And we're going to talk about how, but first we have something of a murder to solve. So how the internet killed the newspaper. The first big thing that happened to newspaper revenue as a result of the internet was in classified advertising, which was traditionally 30% of a newspaper's revenue source. It became replaced by free services such as Craigslist, which moved online, offered people the same exact service, but none of the revenue that they, taking away the revenue of newspapers. In addition to that, people were able to find other content for free on the internet. Now, the result of this is that circulation has dropped 10% just since 2003, and it was dropping already. And for younger generations who've grown up used to getting their content for free, it's dropped 32%. And this doesn't just take away subscription revenue, it also decreases the worth of display ads, which were previously lucrative, the things that newspapers relied on to fund serious journalism. Since 2003, they've dropped by 47%. And so you might think, okay, well, newspapers are expensive to print. Why don't they just go with the internet, put their content online? We've seen people try this. It's cheaper to distribute content on the internet than it is to print it. But the problem is that ads on the internet really aren't worth as much money as they were in print, and the business model that made the newspaper function can't really be replicated online. Online, newspapers don't enjoy regional monopolies or compete with just one or two competitors in their local community. They compete with every other newspaper in the world. They compete with blogs. They compete with aggregators like the Huffington Post, who steal their content but don't give them the money for it. And services like Google News, which organize content based not on outlets, but based on topics. Functions that used to make newspapers necessary things for us to have in our local community, as simple as finding movie times or real estate listings, are now much better handled by internet services that have spent tens of thousands of dollars perfecting their technologies, money that newspapers don't have to spend on those things. But perhaps the most serious blow to the funding structure of serious journalism has come in the unbundling of the news. Newspapers are inherently bundled in that when you purchase them for one section, say sports, you implicitly subsidize the other sections of the newspaper, like the more serious journalism that costs tons of money but isn't really as profitable. Well, what's happened is on the internet, niche websites have allowed people to get just the content they're looking for. And this is especially appealing to advertisers who are looking to target a very specific demographic. Unlike serious news, which is often arduous, unpopular, controversial, something that advertisers aren't as interested in having their ads alongside. You know, it's a lot easier to sell an SUV alongside a sports game than it is alongside images of war in the Middle East, for instance. And so what we're seeing is that this unbundling of the news, coupled with the relentless decline in circulation and ad revenue and subscription revenue, has created a situation where the newspaper, the funding structure which supported substantial journalism is no longer there. And so the newspaper industry has responded to this, and that's how the internet killed the newspaper. So the newspaper industry has responded to this not very well. The first thing they've done is they've decreased expensive reporting overseas, substantial journalism, and they've replaced it with much cheaper to produce lifestyle fare, like home and garden sections. And we've seen our community newspapers literally getting thinner as they're taking out a lot of the content. Since 2003, there has been, and this is perhaps the worst thing, a 32% decline in state house coverage. What this means is that state houses, state and local governments are going uncovered. The people who are there to find corruption in them are no longer able to do that. So we can expect that we're going to give rise to a new era of incompetence and corruption in state government. And we're seeing this now with these budget fights that are going on and the deficit scares, where really spurious accounting is getting a free pass because when the governors and things are marketing it to the public, because there aren't news outlets there to say, well, those numbers don't add up, and that doesn't really make any sense. And in North Carolina, we looked up the Herald-Sun, the Fayetteville Observer, and the Wilmington Star-News, in the past few years have gotten rid of their state house coverage altogether. And when you limit the number of newspapers that are covering the state house, it makes it much easier for government to manage their message, to only control a few outlets. There aren't the competition between journalists that there would otherwise be, which encourages perhaps corrupt relationships with journalists. So if any of the students here have as a plan becoming a corrupt state politician, this is good news for you, and it's the best time to be doing it. So Erick is going to come up here and talk about how the post-newspaper landscape, and we have two speakers because we're sort of studying different parts of this, is antithetical to substantial and serious journalism, and how in the absence of newspapers, our country faces the untenable prospect of sustaining democracy without a functioning news media. So, thank you.
So as Chase discussed, newspapers are dying and the internet is certainly the future for news. But how is this transition changing the content, changing the news itself? And what are the different habits being encouraged by both newspapers and the internet of news consumers and news readers? Well, we found two of the primary differences to be rapidity and brevity, both the speed at which news is coming to us, the speed at which we're consuming it, and then the size and the thoroughness of that news. Now, with daily newspapers, journalists just used to have a lot more time. They had more time to report on the ground, more time to do research, and news readers in turn had more time to read the news, and between news cycles had time to consider the news and speak about it with others in their communities. But on the internet, news outlets are now forced to compete at an incredible speed to report news faster than one another, with each wasted minute possibly costing them thousands of page views and retweets and hence ad revenue. But as news is required to be produced faster, it's meaning that journalists are spending less time fact-checking, less time editing, and we're spending less time reading it and considering it. Now, the demand for quick news is often even outpacing the ability of these journalists to verify the truth of that news. Even a reputable organization like NPR has fallen subject to this, as they reported that Gabby Giffords incorrectly had died. At the time, they hadn't verified this. They hadn't even spoken to anyone at the hospital at which she was being taken care of. So the news is just getting less reliable. In fact, a recent survey revealed that less than a half of online articles are even being fully edited. Now, one of a more humorous result of this new demand for fast news has been that on occasion, news is even being pre-written. It's preceding the events it's regarding. And so you have instances like this in which obituaries are being leaked, in this case from CNN. Now, I know Dick Cheney no longer has a heart. It was recently taken out, but he's definitely alive, I assure it. So not only is news getting faster, it's also getting necessarily shorter. And as news is increasingly being delivered over our handheld devices and in Twitter feeds and Facebook feeds and in tiny little windows all over our screen, it's obviously just getting shorter. But that's making it increasingly difficult to communicate complex legislation, the substance of our news. 140 characters wasn't enough to explain the function of the healthcare reform bill. 2-paragraph blogs just simply aren't enough to explain the complexities of implementing a no-fly zone in Libya. But it's not only these new forms of social news that have been getting shorter, excuse me. News itself has been getting much shorter. In fact, it's getting half as short. And what's being lost is context. What's being lost is thorough analysis, the very substance of what makes news important. But news isn't just getting faster, and it's not just getting shorter. There's suddenly a lot more of it. And I'm afraid we're finding that the increase in quantity of news has not resulted in an increase in quality. In fact, quite the opposite. Now, communities used to be only served by 1 or 2 papers, and that made those papers voices of authority in their community. They were expected to deliver the news professionally and objectively and had a certain responsibility to those communities. But online, with so many news sources to choose from, people are, of course, choosing news that they already agree with, news that reinforces their pre-existing ideologies and partisan narratives. And, of course, news outlets are happy to do this. News outlets like Huffington Post and Daily Caller are finding it very profitable to cater to the pre-existing narratives and political ideologies of their readers. And without local built-in communities, they're forced to do this. They're forced to stake out claim on small niches on the internet in order to maintain ad revenue. But when you have news outlets on the left creating, say, political narratives and framing facts in certain ways to appease their base, and news outlets on the right doing the same thing, it's depriving us of an agreed-upon set of facts on which we can premise public debate. Let's take, as a case study, Sarah Palin and death panels. Now, on August 7th, 2009, in the midst of the raucous Tea Party-dominated healthcare town halls, Sarah Palin made a now rather infamous Facebook post in which she said that the healthcare legislation was going to create death panels and that they were going to be pulling the plug on Granny as she was deemed to be no longer contributing to society. Now, within the next week, nearly every major media organization refuted this claim, saying it was outright false, no such panel existed, nothing like this existed in the legislation. Despite that, conservative outlets, and Fox News in particular, continued to use this verbiage, continued to say, yes, we're going to pull the plug, they are going to pull the plug on Granny. And so it should have come as no surprise then when 1 week after Sarah Palin made this Facebook post, 50% of Americans incorrectly believed that their health care would be rationed by this new bill, that these death panels indeed existed. Now, Democrats quickly realized that in the new media landscape, they had no means of communicating the complexities of the bill. They had no means of explaining to the mass public that that wasn't true and that's not what the bill did. And so as a result, more than a year later, so they actually even removed the provision from the bill and sent the provision in question, not the provision that set up death panels. But conservative news outlets continued to use the language, continues to say death panels and to say rationing. And so now, more than a year after this bill was passed, 36% of seniors incorrectly believe that health reform is going to be rationing their care. And so that's what we've seen in the internet. It's become really difficult to combat lies, to combat mistruths, because when you have that many sources available, you're always going to be able to find something that affirms your point of view, that affirms your beliefs, no matter how incorrect or inaccurate they are. This has given conspiracies a new public platform in our news, things like the suspicion that George Bush was somehow behind 9/11 or that Barack Obama isn't a citizen. These would have been once excluded completely from public discourse as they're so plainly spurious. But now they have this new public platform because of the internet. And so we think that this is the new media landscape, that this is what news is in the land of the internet, that the rapidity and brevity encouraged by the internet is making our news shorter, it's making it less thorough, it's making it less reliable, and that the numerous news sources are giving lies and conspiracies a new platform and making it increasingly difficult for us to have an agreed upon set of facts to premise our public debate on.
And we're afraid that it actually it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. Right now, Alex Jones from Harvard Center for the Press estimates that 85% of the original reporting you find on the internet, or stories that are regurgitating original reporting, or come from print newspapers. So they're not, and as we continue to have print newspapers dying, we can expect that to become less. And what we're getting on the internet isn't the same kind of news, that other 15%. The difference is that in print we expect news of verification. We expect journalists to do their jobs, to make those phone calls, to check those facts. On the internet, most of it is just speculation, punditry, things that happen around the news, around the reporting that journalists are doing. And I like to think of it as being like news junk food. It's bad for your brain. It's not good. It looks like news. It's sort of about news. It purports to be news, but it's mostly just the speculation and punditry of the internet, and it misses the, I guess, the intellectual nutrients of a better news diet. And so the problem is it changes the way we think about political issues. Politicians suddenly become, if they're covered at all, if political issues are covered at all, they become treated like celebrities, perhaps maybe Obama shirtless on the beach. And when they're not covered like celebrities, they're not covered at all. And instead, much of the news that people are getting on these news sites are the most epic catfights of all time, which is actually a pretty good video, but is probably just not very necessary in terms of news. So Atlantic writer Nicholas Carr has written a book called The Shallows, where he says more than just changing our reading habits by making them more shallow, the internet is actually changing the way we think, because we're spending time within this environment where you're reading a little bit, but then you're responding to a message, you're responding to clicking through other tabs. Oh, you've got a text on your cell phone, and it's decreasing, the attention spans of an already attention deficit nation. So it's like we're not probably going to be getting rid of all of these mediums anytime soon. So a lot of the consequences of our laptops and our tablets and our cell phones that we're reading on, they're not going to go away. But there still might be hope for how we fix journalism. Journalism could still at least exist in this new media landscape, but we've got to find a way to pay for it.
So what can we do, and what can we do to save journalism? Thank you. Well, obviously, it's going to take money, as Chase said. Now, there have been two primary solutions proposed by the industry so far, that is ad revenue and paywalls. Most of them so far are only relying on ad revenue. But serious journalism is, as Chase said earlier, really expensive and hasn't been seen to be very popular online, and so it's not appealing to advertisers. Take Huffington Post again for an example. Now, despite their millions and millions of page views every single month, they have only 7 full-time reporters on staff, and much of their content is still originating from the few existing media giants who aren't profiting from Huffington Post ad revenue. And some news outlets are trying to supplement their ad revenue with paywalls by making you subscribe to have access to their site. But recent polls suggest that people aren't going to pay for it, that 82% in one particular poll of Americans are unwilling to pay for access to their very favorite news site. With so much free news available, it seems people don't see the point of paying for it. Newsday, which was the 10th most widely circulated newspaper in the country, recently tried this. They put up a paywall. In 3 months after they put up their paywall, they had 35 subscribers. Now, later this week, New York Times is going to be instituting their version of a paywall, and while we can't predict what will happen, I think it's probably safe to say that the viability of a paywall to sustain a news operation will largely share the fate of New York Times, so we wait anxiously to see what will happen. But what are other options? There have been numerous nonprofit journalistic ventures that have popped up on the internet recently in places like ProPublica, who do a lot of good reporting. And while we think they're providing really valuable service, it's just unlikely that they'll ever replicate the immense and expensive journalistic infrastructure that once maintained our rich, vibrant, diverse news media and newspaper media. So which brings us to public funding. Now, we currently, compared to other countries, are funding our public media at only a fraction of the amount, less than 4% per capita than Britain, and even less compared to some of the Scandinavian countries. But even with this small investment, it's allowed NPR, for example, to be the only large journalistic organization that's been growing this decade. They've been hiring hundreds of journalists, opening numerous foreign bureaus, and their listenership is increasing. So if we were able to increase this total amount, the total amount we are spending on public media, we might be able to compensate for the billions of dollars of ad revenue lost. However, this small amount we're currently spending is, even right now, facing perhaps one of its fiercest attacks from a partisan Congress, and so even this option, though hopeful, seems politically almost impossible right now. And so though there are many problems and many solutions and they're complex, it seems highly unlikely that our news media is ever going to be able to communicate these problems and communicate these solutions, and hence there's never going to be a widespread conversation about how we can save journalism. And so I'd say we both think the prospects for journalism are rather dim.
And so as we enter this brave new digital media landscape, we ask that we consider which things our media serve us well for, our mediums serve us well for, and which things we do not. And that if we don't find another solution to fund journalism, which so far they haven't figured out, there are a lot of consequences that we could face as a result. So thank you, guys.
Do you want to take this off, or does someone else do that?